Employers of Reddit, what's the most overqualified applicant to a position you've ever received? I worked HR at an amusement park. A guy came in who wanted to drive the little train that goes around the park. He'd been an arson and murder investigator for 30 years in a major US city and now just wanted to relax and drive a train. After much begging from us, he eventually agreed to become the new security manager, but only if we promised to let him drive the train on his days off. When I was a manager at GameStop back in 2009-2010, I had a guy apply for a store associate position. He had a master's in marketing. In his interview, I asked him why he was applying for a job he was so overqualified for, and he said the marketing firm he worked at before closed down suddenly and he needed something to keep the lights on while he searched for a better job. He got the position and was actually still there when I left GameStop. I recommended him to our regional manager as my replacement. Don't know if he got it or not though. Bold move to just straight up admit that he was planning to quit as soon as something better came along. I hired a man with a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in sociology, and a master's in anthropology with 20 years of teaching college experience as a janitor. I don't know why he doesn't teach anymore, but he was having a really hard time finding a entry-level job and he really needs the insurance as he has a life-threatening illness that is being controlled with medication. Absolutely great employee and very interesting to converse with. It feels weird to be his supervisor though, as I am a high school dropout. At my middle school we had a janitor who had a degree in philosophy. He was a very interesting person and one of the few people I remember fondly from middle school. Eons ago I was an office manager for a kitty litter plant. I did some hiring as part of that gig. A guy came to apply to work on the production line. He had a 3-page resume with a master's degree and numerous publications, extensive community involvement, etc. I flat out asked him why he wants to be slinging 30 lbs boxes of kitty litter on the assembly line all day. He told me it was because a friend of his got into amazing shape very quickly and he found out it was thanks to working at our plant. We were short, so I figured why stereotype and told him he could start the next day. He lasted a grand total of 3 days on the production line. That's hilarious. A scientist, a physicist I believe, with over 20 years of research at the University of Cambridge in his work history applied for a very basic administrative job. He was denied for having a lack of relevant work experience. He applied to replace me BTW. I was leaving that job. I was 19 or so and it was my job while I was at uni. My co-workers interviewed a super overqualified guy for a crappy retail position at the bank I work at. He was an Eagle Scout, went to a prestigious college, top of his class, won a bunch of scholarships, and basically sold his entire childhood to volunteer work. His resume was impressive, but apparently he was just fed up with corporate politics at the very well-known company he had just quit. He was instead offered a job in one of the upper departments where I work. I was hiring someone to do some basic data entry work. I was paying like $10 HR or something and was expecting to hire a student or something. Had a guy submit everything and he was mid-30s with over a decade of engineering experience on top of college. I couldn't fathom why he was applying for the job. He ended up storming off from the interview, so I suppose he was bitter about something. I worked with a guy who was a former business executive. Very intelligent guy, so had some really interesting conversations. We both made $8 HR in a call center. I was trying to make extra cash in between IT jobs. He was just retired and bored sitting at home alone day living off his considerable assets. Still, one of the hardest working guys in the company. If I was just working for something to do, I think a call center would be about my last choice. I was interviewing candidates for customer service positions in a call center. This woman was a Navy medic, trained in combat situations, had a couple of degrees. She was basically the last person I expected to see sitting across from me. I accepted her for the position, but she never accepted the job offer. I don't blame her. I recently worked with a retired army medic. He was a great guy who worked hard and didn't put up with bulls. He also didn't last long because he got a better job at a hospital. A friend of mine once put an ad on Craigslist, $20 for a couple hours to help her load a moving truck. One guy sent his full resume. A few weeks ago I had to hire a teenager to put away books after school at the public library. One 14-year-old girl sent in a full resume and cover letter along with 3-page long letters of recommendation. I interviewed her, but every question she answered she found a way to bring up one of the many awards she'd won in middle school. It was a bit off-putting. She didn't get the job. I hired a guy with several former CTO and VP of technology titles for an entry-level tech support position. The recession was not kind to him. He was the best hire I've made and killed it in that position, and others he moved up to in that company, for the next several years. Technology workers in the US who are not in their 20s have a lot harder time than most people think. H-1B abuse and outsourcing have made the jobs not nearly as plentiful as people think. I had someone apply for a risk analyst position who I believe had 3 masters and 1 PhD between math, chemistry, and physics. I knew something was going to be up, but wanted to bring them in and find out what. Despite them having a meticulous resume, they couldn't speak a word of English. Very awkward time. I didn't hire him, but there's a man working at my old high school with a master's in aerospace engineering and a couple other degrees. He worked for NASA and was one of the men who helped design the craft that put men on the moon. He's the guy who checks to see if you have been signed out before you leave campus. He's got an amazing sense of humor and he has this air about him that just makes him fun to talk to. I spoke to him about his history a couple times. It's just weird to think that the guy keeping kids from sneaking off campus is a little rocket scientist. My PhD dad lost his job when I was in middle school. He applied for a job at Wendy's and was told he was overqualified. It was a tough time for him and our family, but things eventually turned around for us. I'm proud of him for being willing to do whatever it took to take care of us. You shouldn't put your advanced degree down if you're serious about the job. I applied for fast food, left off my BS and Ms, lied and told them I had no degree. I got the job. I had 18 years experience working in a scratch bakery as a baker and full-time cake decorator. Also years of high-end restaurant experience as a side job. Quit the side job and few years later wanted a part-time job to save money to move to Hawaii. Taco Bell sent me an email saying I wasn't qualified among many other places. Pizza Hut is the only place that I could get to hire me as a driver. It was for the best. I loved working with those guys. Now I live in Hawaii. Not an employer, but when I was a freshman in college, I worked in the dining hall with a line cook who had been a corporate financial manager at a large local corporation. His company had gone under and laid off almost everyone, and he was having a hard time finding a position. He was friends with the head of dining services and ended up working as a line cook. I'm pretty sure he got promoted very quickly to management, causing some bitter feelings among the other cooks. My understanding was that the company knew they'd have a management position open several months after he applied, so they asked him to work as a cook until the position opened. As a student worker, he was the nicest man I worked with, and an incredibly hard worker. I was glad when I came back the next academic year and found him as a manager, and I hope he's doing well now. I own a catering business restaurant bar. I had a lady applying for a waitress job last year. She worked for IRS, government. She was a top accountant, but made some small money laundering at her last workplace, so nobody wanted to hire her. I hired her anyway. Top employee for less money. Everybody deserves a second chance. I was manager of a small cafe and people used to drop in resumes all the time. One day a woman who was in her early 60s came in with a resume. Usually I would thank people and put it aside until after service, but on that day I happened to take a quick glance. Her last position said she had been a consultant specialist in emergency medicine. I then saw Doctors Without Borders and a further 30ish years of a medical career. I sat down with her and asked her why she wanted the job. She said she'd recently retired and was bored out of her skull. She was looking for a job that had the same energy requirements but without the responsibility or shift length. She then said she'd work for free, but I said if I gave her a job I'd have to pay her. She asked for $5 an hour, to which I said I'd have to pay her minimum wage. I put her on a trial and she smashed it, so I offered her 3 days a week. She was easily the most organized and stress-free staff member I've ever employed. She worked for us for a bit under a year before deciding to go back into aid work. She also donated all her earnings from that job. Still one of my favorite people in the world. I was a supervisor at a restaurant and the hostess had her master's in hospitality tourism management. She never worked before because she was always in school and had to start off somewhere. I was a host with a master's for 6 months last year. I had several years of work experience, but finding a full-time job was a B. I still don't have a job related to my degrees, but I had an interview last week. I should hear something before the end of the week. I used to hang out at a small garage that worked on mostly dirt bikes, four-wheelers, and sleds. A guy came in one day in a business suit asking about a job. He seemed friendly, talked for a bit. His only request was to have a separate work area and to kinda be left alone. The next day the owner of the shop came out of his office with the guy's resume in hand and asked if it was a joke. Everyone told him it wasn't to their knowledge. Anyway, the guy went to MIT, had a ton of helicopter mechanic experience and was last working for some aeronautics company. The owner of the shop called him and had him come in to talk. The guy's little brother had some terminal disease and wanted to be around more. He worked there for a couple years till his brother died and he left. I left town right as the guy was hired, but my friends at the shop said he was freaking magic with engines, but never really warmed up to anybody. A customer had brought his sled into the shop constantly for blown engines. New sled, third engine, and nobody knew what was causing it. Customer was peeved because he was only getting 1 or 2 rides per season and the rest of the time it was in the shop. The overqualified guy comes out of his corner and looks down in the fuel tank and tells them to replace the fuel pickup hose. The fuel pickup line was cracked and sucked air when the fuel got under half tank, caused the engine to not get oil to lubricate. 2-stroke. Holy crap. Engine Rain Man sounds like someone I'd want on my team. Years ago while in college I had an engineer apply at Wendy's. Floored me. Then she explained that her and husband had just been transferred and she needed something until she got hired elsewhere, which made sense. I don't really understand people getting jobs like that to tide them over. You have to wait a couple of weeks for a check. Why not go be a server or delivery driver and get money that night? The janitor at my high school was a surgeon in Vietnam. He moved to America to get a better life for his son, but he couldn't speak English very well and took the job because it let his kid go to a private school basically for free. As soon as his kid graduated he quit. Steady hands. The best. A CPA with about a dozen different accounting jobs applying for a minimum wage pick and pack job. I didn't want to hire him, but a coworker went over my head and hired him. Turned out he was a drunk. Only lasted a few shifts before I fired him. Some guy who was a minister in the Egyptian government. No idea who. Unfortunately, it was a few years ago and I'd only been there a few months. Applied for a job at the company I work for, just mapping. They had to reject him for lack of relevant experience, but the hiring manager wrote him a letter of commiseration in rejecting him. Feeling bad she had to reject a minister. As to why he was applying, not a clue. Office gossip suspects he was trying to secure a job overseas to get out, maybe. My ex was a high-up government official in the country of Turkey. He could not find a decent job in America for the life of him despite all his education, top security clearance, languages and credentials. The lack of money and job title drove him literally nuts. After 7 years of looking he went back to Turkey. I didn't hire him, but my postman was a university professor for several decades before deciding he just wanted to be a postman. Was at a job interview at an arcade once, when another applicant walks in with a suit and briefcase, so I guess he was overqualified. When I went through basic training there was a recruit who was in his mid-30s, Chinese fellow from a rural area. After talking to him I learned that he had a master's in physics dealing with lasers or something like that. Enlisted to get his citizenship and give back to the country that welcomed him. Nice guy. Service guarantees citizenship. Former VP of a large bank in Canada applied at my gas station because, and I quote, "That bee wants me to support her and her frick boy. I have to give her half," but they didn't say half of what. I saw him a year later happily employed as a garbage man. He said his ex was furious and had to get a job. Dang, this is too good, hahaha. My friend has a master's and almost didn't get a hostess job for being overqualified. They figured she'd get a job in her field and leave. Almost a year later she's still there. Either her field isn't hiring or she can't break into it for whatever reason. I wasn't the employer, but an employee, and I had a co-worker that you could say was overqualified. The manager and owner running this restaurant really had no idea what they were doing, as the owner had purchased the restaurant as a hobby and the manager was promoted prematurely due to a string of managers walking out due to the owner's inexperience. At one point we had 4 total employees in a restaurant that required 9 or 10 total to run smoothly, so the manager and owner were quite desperate to hire people. During that period, they literally had people coming in off the streets to work for one night so they could buy some extra time to hire a permanent employee. They had posted some ad on a job site that said $15 hour serving position was available, which was very easily misinterpreted at $15 plus tips. We had a guy come in for an interview in his 30s, a very professional looking dude applying for an entry-level serving position looking for some extra income as he was trying to start his family. Our boss for some reason never talked about wages in the interview, so it went completely under the radar for this guy. This new guy came to his first day of work ready to make bank, and within 5 minutes we got talking and he said something like, "If it's a busy night and I make a lot of tips, I will be making more per hour here than I do at my aerospace engineering job." And then I just told him he must be mistaken because we were making $4.95 an hour and the restaurant was never busy enough to break $10 an hour. The guy took off his name tag and walked out. We never saw him again. Not an employer, but my older sister has a PhD in some medical field. I've read her book, which is on TB. Quite amazing. Anyhow, she has seriously struggled to get a job and had to start taking her PhD off of her CV as everyone kept saying she was overqualified. She's a teaching assistant, and when her colleagues somehow found out she has a PhD, their jaws dropped. I myself dropped out of uni. I am kind of in this position right now. I have 16 years experience as a software design lead in COBOL. There is almost zero demand for that near me and I'm losing my job in a week. I have a few years of Java dev work, so I'm trying to make that transition, but it is difficult. I used to work in a retail store as a student worker. Most of the employees were people who left school at 18 or even 16. Can't say anything bad about most of them, but TBH, they weren't the smartest bunch. Anyways, there was one guy with a PhD in chemistry. Although he enjoyed working there, it was the biggest waste of knowledge I've ever seen. And this is the problem I have with some of this thread, the waste of knowledge. Not a manager, but I got to rifle through the resumes at my old job as a receptionist for my replacement. It was a small family-owned business. Anyway, I remember one applicant listed all the firearms he was trained at, including machine guns. This is actually strange because guns are illegal in Australia. I assume he was an ex-army guy and needed to submit his resume to X number of places in order to keep getting benefits. Why else would anyone think that a list of guns one is proficient in and nothing else is relevant to a reception position? If he was applying for a receptionist position at Centrelink, it might have been relevant. An old professor of mine, a little less than a year after I graduated university, I went back there recruiting for a summer internship at the company I worked for. My professor came by looking for a summer internship, dropped off his resume and CV full of publications and articles and grant work, a doctorate and 2 masters, for a job where basically the only requirement was understand the concepts he taught in his intro level course. To be fair, he was upfront about the reason he wanted the job and it was pretty reasonable. He just wanted to keep up with what's going on in the industry. I have had a guy tell me when applying for a butcher's job, and I quote, "I didn't think you understood what the job was, and that you may not want it because you came in here dressed up for the job interview." Facepalm. While I wouldn't turn someone down for being dressed decent for a job interview, I liked it when someone showed up for an interview at one of the fab shops I worked at, not dressed badly, but dressed as if he or she was ready to go to work right then. Not an employer, but I went to a not well-known university in New Jersey and my law professor was an absolute genius. He graduated from NYU and wrote 3 books. He essentially knew the answer to any question anybody ever had. Some students didn't like him because he actually challenged his students and the class wasn't a cakewalk. I loved the class though and was wondering why this guy is teaching at some crappy school in NJ nobody cares about. Worked at Hot Topic as a store manager and had a guy come in and apply for a part-time associate position, but he was the bassist of a very well-known emo band. I was like, why do you want to work here? He told me that he could already see the end was coming, less attendance at the shows, the burnout of touring more and more just to keep the same amount of ticket sales, album sales to make the record label happy, etc. He was already predicting the death of the band and wanted to get ahead of it, so he wanted to work for us through the holiday season, get something on his resume, and apply to college. He ended up working at a store closer to his parents' house and went to college. I have no idea where he went after that, but I do know about 2 years later we stopped carrying their shirts and merch. He was right, the band didn't make it, and no, I won't name the band. People deserve to live private lives even if they were famous for a few years. John Paul Jones. Yep. I work with a guy who was a former Marine Scout sniper with 14 years active duty and a bachelor's degree in business. We are both apprentices to a mason in my city. He's a really interesting guy, but I was really confused his decision to try to become a mason. He told me learning the trade is interesting to him because his grandfather was and it helps him overcome some of his PTSD. He's a really nice guy and an amazing worker. Had a guy come to work at my company where we sell houses. I asked him what he used to do and he said he was in sales. I asked him what kind of sales. He said he was in restaurant sales and had done $2 million the year before. I said, wow dude, you were in restaurant sales? What does that mean? Were you on the wholesale side? He said no, front of house. I asked him to clarify and after a few minutes of him explaining I realized that he was a server at a restaurant. So he wasn't technically overqualified unless you asked him. I applied to work 3 months as a janitor after finishing my master's in English. Cleaned up a schizophrenic patient's vomit and made him not feel bad about it. His mom just brought him McDonald's. I've been there. Literally. Same psych ward. Same age. Teenager. Just broke. Schizophrenia hit 1722. I was glad to do it. His first taste of outside after losing it. Ate too fast. Med side effects. Made me proud to help. I also encouraged the doctors, telling them how much their counterparts helped me years earlier. 18-19. First 2 years of college. 19-20 breakdown. 21-26 graduation with masters. 43 now. Only had one other breakdown. Medications help a lot. A few years ago I was a security guard making like $12 an hour. It was good money for me at the time, but nothing to brag about obviously. I worked with an older black gentleman named Bernard. He was awesome. He had multiple master's degrees, was an uber successful real estate investor with millions saved, and he basically won the game of life. Only reason he came out of retirement and decided to work as a security guard was because his wife passed and he was bored sitting around. He would have done it for free. He was amazing. I have a bachelor's degree in teaching, but I applied and was hired at a grocery store as a bagger. When they asked me why I was applying, I explained that it makes more sense for me as a new mom to have a night job, spend time with my baby, and not pay for daycare. Unfortunately, there's not a great variety of jobs when you want to work nights or weekends. Not an employer, but I was on a job site last week where there was a floor layer from Iran who was a doctor before he emigrated. His wife is a cashier at a grocery store and she was a nuclear engineer. Beats being dead, I guess. I am one of those overeducated people, as is my husband, and I also hire people. I have 3 BSc degrees and work in a small insurance agency. The girls I hired all have at least an MA if not multiple bars. It's an easy job, only pays about $40k a year, and a high school graduate could do it if they got the right licensure. I just got tired of politics, as did the other girls. My husband is a PhD and quit academia to work in the cafeteria of a certain popular bulk goods store. He's considering going to be a guard at a local prison. For some of us, happiness is far and away more important than money. If it's happiness you are looking for, don't be a guard at a prison. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.